Aside from Halo 2, I can't remember a time when I let myself get so hyped for a game the way I did for Cyberpunk 2077. I saw the initial teaser trailer, I saw the E3 gameplay reveal because I happened to be there, but other than that, I refused to watch anything because I knew from the get-go that CD Projekt made good games and I was excited for it. And goddamn, it stayed on my mind ever since then. And I suppose you could say I let my expectations get just a little bit out of control. Because of the scope of this game, this review will probably be a bit more in-depth than my previous videos. I will not be discussing story spoilers, but you can expect that I will give my overall thoughts on the story and a lot of thoughts about the individual aspects of the game, what I liked, what I didn't like, and what I hope could be better. And let me start off by saying that I definitely enjoyed Cyberpunk a lot, and to say otherwise would be disingenuous. I completed the story, I've seen multiple endings, I 100%ed all the side content, all the little icons on the map, except for buying the cars because they're an obscene amount of money. And I had one quest that was bugged and I couldn't complete it. And my gameplay clock is about 80 hours. I still have a few achievements left over. I kind of want to 100% it, but I'm going to save those for another time, maybe a year from now or something when I want to do another playthrough. And even after my 80 hours of playing, I still wish that there was more to do. And the game definitely captured my interest. It was all I wanted to do for the days I was playing it. And I still wish that there was more. I want to do more. However, since the night I started playing, my feelings on this game have been basically a complete roller coaster, and it's taken me a lot of sitting down and just thinking about the game and reconciling all my thoughts and trying to put a cohesive pattern of thoughts together and try to say what I feel about this game. So this will be that.
Finally, someone I can fucking fight.
So when you start the game, you create a character and you choose your life path, which is basically your background. Character creation gives you the ability to change your face, your hair, your skin tone, and accessories and cyberware, that sort of stuff. Aside from that, you can't really change your body type. You have the two general options, but you won't be able to make your guy more muscular or make them overweight, or you're kind of just one body shape, which is athletic and sort of slim. One odd issue I had creating my character was when you would select the palette of gray. Instead of gray, it would show in the character as green. So I wasn't quite sure what I was getting. And then I ended up with a mismatched hair and beard combo. And it was made worse because I realized that I couldn't change my hair in game or get a haircut. So I ended up playing 80 hours with a freaking monstrosity. So make sure you're happy with your character before you start your journey. Aside from changing your character's look, you'll also choose a life path, which is either a nomad, a street kid, or a corpo, and that's sort of your origin story, and it will determine how you start off the story in the game. I started off as a nomad, which began with my character out in the Badlands, where I immediately met up with a guy named Jackie, who's the best. Jackie's awesome, I love him, and about 20 or 30 minutes later, you reach the city, and then all the stories for the life path sort of converge. As you go through the game, you'll also be presented with dialogue options that are specific to your origin choice. After a pretty cool mission, which is the one you see in the first E3 demo, the game will partially open up and allow you to explore the world, a good amount, not all of it, but a good amount. And the most prominent feature of Cyberpunk 2077 is its setting and its world. Night City is one of the most detailed and well-realized video game settings I've ever seen, and when you're let off your leash and allowed to explore freely, the sense of scale was initially actually overwhelming. Even after dozens of hours, I would find myself looking upwards at various buildings and I would see stuff that I never saw before. There's so much detail crammed into the city, it's bananas. Because the city is built in layers, you'll find that the sort of verticality in different layers of the city is what gives it so much life and believability. Early on, you'll leave your apartment that's located inside of a mega building and you'll walk outside of your unit, you'll look down, you'll look up, and you'll see the scale of what the city is sort of built around, and you're 20 stories up and there's another 20 stories above you, and it's huge. It's a big freaking building. Think the movie Dread, but it's this game's take on it. Outside you'll find roads stacked on top of each other, multi-tiered markets, tunnels, buildings that have exits to 3 different levels of the streets, and it creates this sort of maze that you would want out of a cyberpunk futuristic city sort of deal. And the city is very dense, both in detail and also clutter. Each area is different with how it's filled out and populated, but CD Projekt does it in a believable and realistic way. Rundown parts of the city will have broken down cars that are falling apart, with rubble scattered around, garbage floating by, walls covered in graffiti, piles of trash bags, and people wandering around or inhabiting it all. There's a really incredible amount of variety in how the city is filled out. And by the time you've walked just a block, you'll pass a dozen different things like street vendors, vending machines, advertisements, trees, and neon lights and all that stuff. And although the assets are reused across the city, they've definitely done a really good job sort of hand building each location in the city and not making it feel like it's a bunch of assets slapped around. The different sections of the city feel unique and reflect the type of people that inhabit them. So the Corpo Plaza is the area where the mega corporations have their flagship buildings, and I found that this was where the architecture of the city was its most impressive and sort of monumental. On the other end of the spectrum, you have areas like Pacifica, and it's clear just from driving around that this used to be a place where people lived. There's, boardwalks and Ferris wheels and stuff like that, but now it's abandoned. And instead of people, it's just like gangs roaming around and tents and fires and all that stuff. The city has a bunch of different districts and sections, and discovering and getting to see all the detail is certainly part of the draw of the game, so I won't show all of them, but just know that there's a bunch of variety there, even though it is one city. And surrounding the city is the Badlands, which is exactly what it sounds like. There's a lot of open space, a lot of dirt, cacti, bushes, and it's very sparsely populated with buildings or people, but there is stuff to look at out there, and there's stuff to do and quests and all that. Beyond the scale and the design of the city, the atmosphere and feel that the game creates is really what makes it special. As you walk or drive through the city, you're surrounded by little intricacies and details. The NPCs will be having conversations about random things. You might hear gunshots in a not-so-distant alley. You're never out of earshot of a TV or billboard that's yelling some dumb sexual advertisement at you. You'll hear flying cars whirring overhead or trains going by, and then you'll have the general hustle and bustle of people yelling at each other or just wandering around the city. When you close your eyes, it feels and sounds like an alive city. The game features dynamic weather, and while it does look nice and pretty on a sunny day, for me, the times that this game looked its best was at night. There's steam billowing out of vents everywhere. There's neon lights and advertisements that will reflect off the puddles in the ground. There's towering holographic advertisements that reach up into the clouds. When the game rains and the fog rolls in, it evokes that feeling of Blade Runner so well. And it was those moments that I definitely felt the most immersed in the world. If you're someone who loves to just sit there, soak in moments in games, I highly encourage you to drive around the city at night when it's raining. Just turn off the radio, listen to the raindrops, maybe just sit still. It's gorgeous. And visually, there are times when Cyberpunk is legitimately the most impressive game I've ever seen. Admittedly, I'm running on a fairly high-end computer. I have an RTX 3080 graphics card, so it's important to note that everyone's experience will vary both in the visual and performance department, so don't take my experience as gospel. And I will be talking more later about performance, especially on last-gen hardware. Like I mentioned above, when it's dark out and some weather rolls in, the game is beautiful. The way it looks as light is diffused through fog is just insanely pretty. And like pretty much every time I saw a wet road with the lights reflecting off of it, I would stop and look at it, take a screenshot, because it's just so freaking pretty to look at. And it's not just the environments in the game, the models of the characters and the cars are incredibly detailed and good looking. The car designs are similar to modern cars, but they'll have their cyberpunk flair to them, whether it be like a weird front end or whatever. You can drive in both first and third person, and while you drive in a first person view, the interior of the cars are where the futuristicness of them really comes through. Take this particular car, the Quadra Avenger, which was one of my personal favorites. It has a yoke-style steering wheel. It has the red lighting accents on everything, and it has that sort of 80s futuristic-style display, and all of that stuff pushed the right buttons for me. And many of the cars have a similar aesthetic, but some of them get more futuristic, and some of them get more basic. And certainly some vehicles have had more love and attention put into their design, but they're pretty much all great to look at. And on the subject of models, the place where the game really made my jaw drop was the faces and the facial expressions. I've never been a person that would stop and take a bunch of screenshots, but when you're talking to a story character, there are moments when the scene is so perfectly lit and the depth and the realism of the faces comes out. It's really something cool to look at, man. Like, I would take these screenshots and people would look at them, and for a brief second you think, is it real? Is it a real person? And while the models themselves are insane, the eyes and also the subtle emotions or micro expressions that display when the characters are talking is the thing, man. It's the thing that makes them so special. There's a character you encounter during the story, and it was just a brief conversation with a receptionist, but she was so striking to me and lifelike that was the moment that I got hooked on taking screenshots. I mean, look at this character. You can see the subtle change in her emotion there, the way her eyes are looking at you. It doesn't feel fake. They nailed something here with the way the expressions are that is really something special. But make no mistake, there are times that Cyberpunk is not a perfect looking game. Oftentimes, the lighting of the scene makes all of the difference, which is why the scenes where you're talking to NPCs, which are the ones that have the most meticulous detail and attention put into them, where the devs have had time to put perfect lighting in the room, maybe some fog, or just have the lights in a perfect position where all the facial details can be brought out, will always look the best. And then there are times when it's super bright out and there's no contrast and things just look okay. They don't look bad, but it's certainly not always the best looking game or what you're seeing in some of these screenshots and videos. Probably the biggest visual discrepancy you'll see in this game is going from a main story character, particularly when you're in dialogue with them for a mission, and then going to like a random NPC that you'll find out in the world. And this is pretty normal. Most games will have a more detailed model for main characters that you're going to be interacting with or seeing in cutscenes. But because this is a first-person game, you're still going to get pretty close to random NPCs, and you'll see that like their faces just are not as detailed. And part of it's lighting, but the other part is that they're just less detailed, whether it be for performance budgets or whatever. And the difference can be really stark. I mean, this is a game where this person exists in the same universe that this person exists. They're the same game with the same settings, just different people. It's wild. And while we're talking about characters and story, the story and the side story missions of Cyberpunk are where I felt it was at its strongest. The main story is not what I expected, and that's a really good thing. Instead of being a story about saving the world and stopping a nuclear bomb from going off, it's a more personal story about V, who is the person you're going to be playing. They're a mercenary who has dreams to make it big in Night City. And I won't say too much plot-wise, but it has some great characters. You'll develop some really cool relationships with them throughout, and it has emotional and funny moments as well. It's hard to say exactly how long the story took in hours. Like I said, my total playtime was 80 hours, but I've seen people make estimates of 20 hours, and that doesn't honestly seem too far off base. It wasn't exactly the longest story in the world, but it was generally really strong. The game is very dialogue heavy. You'll constantly be in conversations, and most of the dialogue and conversations you have with people do feel really natural, and it helps to create a connection to the characters you're meeting. If I had one problem with the story, it's that although you are making a lot of dialogue choices, they really don't have a large impact on the world or story all that often, with the exception of the choices that you're going to be making at the end of the game. This didn't change my enjoyment of the story that was told, and I felt like my choices at the end were significant, but it does sting when a game gives you the illusion of choice without the impact. And to give credit where credit is due, there was a moment where the game didn't give me a choice, and it said, this is what's happening, fucking deal with it. But I went with my gut, and instead of using a dialogue choice, I used my actions, and I did make an effect on the game's story and world, and I was pretty surprised and happy that I was able to do that. The side stories, aka side jobs, are where you're going to be seeing most of the development of the characters in the story. These are the few times that the game's missions stray away from just killing a bunch of people and give you a chance to do something a little different. The game will also give you a chance at romance from these side missions, although for as organic as the friendships with these characters feel, the way the romances present themselves can be a little bit awkward. The game's story missions, side jobs, gigs, and scanner hustles all have stories to tell, and they range from, the main story to very, very small micro stories where you're just going to go to a location and find a piece of dialogue or text. These missions in your journal and the icons on your map are going to be the primary way that the game directs you around the world and sort of shows you which areas are worth exploring. And while I do think that having little micro stories for all of these things are interesting, the majority of the objectives for the missions themselves devolve into just go to place, kill a bunch of dudes, which is fine. It's been done in games a bunch of times, but you won't get that much variety in how you're executing these missions. Although there is some, particularly in the side jobs. The places or buildings that these missions will take you to are laid out in such a way that you'll have a choice in how you decide to tackle them. If you played the recent Deus Ex games, the way the missions are structured is definitely reminiscent of that. So if you have a building full of gang members, you can choose to go in the front door, just shooting dudes, or you can scout around the outside of the building and look for a vent to crawl in or a window to open. And you can find other options of ways to tackle that job or sneak into the building. Combat includes guns, melee weapons, quick hacking, and stealth. Early on, the game's combat was pretty underwhelming, and it makes a pretty bad first impression. And I think this is because early on, the guns you get would take more than a magazine to kill an enemy, and so people would feel super bullet spongy. And then on top of that, the iron sights that you would get on the guns also made just like aiming at enemies a challenge. It takes a little bit, but like to give the game some credit, as you get better gear, the combat does start to get fun. And I definitely had fun shooting dudes and chopping dudes up. So with guns, there are 3 distinct weapon types that each gun will belong to. Power weapons will let you see your bullet's trajectory, so you can use ricochet as a tool and maybe shoot around cover. Unfortunately, this category was sort of bizarre for me. I couldn't find a situation where trying to use the ricochet and aim around cover felt more advantageous than just walking around and shooting a dude in the face. But that said, the game also has tech and smart weapons, which are pretty much what I would want out of a futuristic cyber gun. The tech weapons let you charge up your shots and shoot through walls, which definitely gives the Red Faction railgun vibes. It feels super overpowered. There's a rifle you get midway through the game, and you can kill an entire squad of people without them ever getting a shot on you, and it's just great. Smart weapons are equally futuristic, and basically you have a big square reticle that takes up, 20% of your screen, and it just targets anyone in front of you. And the bullets will sort of swarm to their targets. They'll take a curved path. So it looks dope, but also lets you shoot multiple people at once and shoot around cover to some extent. And both of these weapon types are very much at home in a futuristic universe. And their added powers definitely add a lot to the feel of the combat. Weapons will also let you add sights and silencers to them, along with weapon mods. And mods generally add pretty minor stat boosts, but there are some that are more significant, such as eliminating vertical recoil while you're shooting. Like I said, after getting over that initial hump of bullet spongy enemies and weak guns, I did have a lot more fun with the combat. But eventually I gave up guns altogether and played almost exclusively with melee weapons, specifically bladed weapons like the mantis blades and the katanas, because chopping people up is the most fun I had in this game. It carried me through legitimately 50 hours of this game. The blades you get are really fast and you can stack attack speed on them, and heads will just fly off people. And oftentimes you would do 3 slashes with your katana and you would cut off a head and an arm or both arms before they hit the ground. And it was so satisfying. It's really fun. Quick hacking and stealth will make up the other half of the combat options, and they can be pretty interesting too. You'll use your scanner to target an enemy and select a hack from the ones you have equipped, and then you execute it. I honestly didn't get too deep with the system. I thought I might be a netrunner type guy, but I found that slicing off heads was more effective and fun. So, I didn't go down that route, but I can see the appeal. I did eventually screw around and try out one that just straight up makes a guy commit suicide, which is very gruesome. The quick hacking does seem like it pairs well with stealth because you're able to do so from the shadows and from afar, and you can distract enemies or have enemies exit the combat state and stuff like that. And the game gives you agency on how you handle encounters, and the whole game is based around combat encounters. So it doesn't force you to play with stealth. It doesn't force you to use guns. You can do whatever you want. Sometimes missions will have stealth as an objective, but it will never be mandatory, and at most you're going to miss out on a little bit of extra cash. As you complete missions and kill enemies, you'll level up, which will unlock additional attribute and perk points, and you'll also level up your street cred as you complete different side missions. Your street cred is basically just another bar to level up, but as you level it up, vendors will make more items available to you, and there'll be more gigs and side jobs that open up as well. The game also features a pretty extensive upgrade tree. You choose an attribute every time you level up, which gives you an upgrade to the relative stats. The attributes will include body, reflexes, tech, intelligence, and cool. Within each of the attribute trees, they have 2 to 3 perk trees, and you can fill those out sort of to augment your play style. An example of these perks are things like having your blades have a chance to cause bleed, and then you'll restore health if you kill an enemy when they're bleeding. Some of them just add passive benefits like a added crit chance, but the game lets you fill out the trees pretty freely. So you don't need to start at one point and branch out. So if you meet the attribute requirements to unlock a perk, you can do so in that tree without any prior investment. One thing I really liked about the perk trees is that they have their own individual level, and those levels will go up as you use the skills relative to those trees. So if you run around and jump during combat, you'll level up your athletics. If you hack a bunch of terminals, you'll level up your quick hacking tree. Each of these trees has 20 levels, and each level gives you a bonus. And it could be like a perk point, or it could be, you know, an added passive attribute to whatever that skill is. This almost feels like an MMO style system where it gives you just a little extra carrot on the stick to keep you going as you level, which to me, I very much enjoy. The game includes a loot system, complete with colored tiers of loot and random attributes and paint jobs that will appear on randomly dropped items. Loot includes armor, weapons, consumables, throwables, crafting and upgrade components, and junk. If we're comparing it to The Witcher 3, which I think is a fair comparison, it feels like the loot is a bit more fleshed out, but to me it's still not quite at like the upper echelon of loot games like, say, Path of Exile or Diablo 3 or Destiny, if you will. The rarity tiers go from common to legendary, and there's also iconic weapons, which are special named weapons that will have some special attribute and some flavor text. These are often the most interesting guns in the game. Plain and simple. They take a base weapon you'd find in the wild, but then they add something to it. So they're always kind of the best version of those guns. For example, this sniper rifle is the same one you might find off an enemy, but instead of just being normal, it has explosive rounds that are fucking dope. There are some problems with the iconic weapons and honestly the itemization of loot in general. So for starters, you'll be able to upgrade a weapon or a piece of armor so that you can boost up its stats. Weapons and armor drop at whatever level your character is, although as far as I can tell, it wasn't possible to see, you know, exactly what level a weapon was. You just kind of had to remember or know. So if you have a level 5 weapon and you're level 10, you could choose to upgrade it to bring the damage up to be in line with other stuff that you've gotten as drops. But the upgrade cost is so exorbitant, it makes no sense to do that. With iconic weapons, you can craft the higher tiered version of that item. So say you have a rare iconic weapon, you can boost it up to epic, but you can only do this to the highest rarity tier. So, you know, if you have an epic iconic weapon, you can only bump it up one time and bring it up to level. So theoretically, you'd want to save doing this until you're closer to max level. Otherwise, you're just going to be out leveling it again. With weapons, this was a problem, but once I accepted it and just put my iconic weapons in storage after they became useless, I just started picking up new weapons and getting a feel for other guns, which is less of an issue. Where it did become a bigger problem was with armor. Upgrading armor is just as cost prohibitive, and because of this, you'll constantly be swapping out armor and looking like a fucking doofus. There's no sort of transmogrification system or system that allows you to have cosmetic slots for armor, so you'll always end up looking really silly. This is my character after 4 hours. I looked like Cyber Ronald McDonald. I know this is a first-person game and you don't see your character outside of the inventory screen or mirrors or a few select cutscenes, but Jesus Christ, there's so many cool-looking people in the world, and I felt like I looked like a fucking jackass my entire time playing the game. It literally wasn't until I had basically completed all of the side content that I finally found some gear that looked okay and had decent stats. Lastly, there's also cyberware, which are basically cybernetic upgrades for your characters, because this is the future. We can put in, cyber eyes. There's a handful of reprodocs around the city, and each of those guys will sell different cyber mods. You'll be able to add cyberware to things like your arms, your legs, your immune system, your skeleton, and so on and so forth. There's a pretty good amount of slots. The different cyberware you add in will also have a rarity tier. You can sometimes find these things laying around in the world as loot, but you can also get them from vendors, and more stuff unlocks as you level up your street cred. The majority of these cyberware upgrades are stat increases, like increasing your stamina or increasing your health or whatever, but some things like mantis blades and double jumps do add their own element to gameplay. In my mind, I was imagining a system that was a bit more grandiose and game-changing. I was thinking perhaps maybe I could get a set of metal arms. Or maybe the more mods I had in my body, the more people would shun me or look at me weird. But it isn't quite that crazy. Once you've seen a couple of the vendors, you pretty much know and have an idea of what's available to you. One of the more disappointing things in the game was when I got to level 50 street cred, it said there would be more cyberware available to me. When I went back, saw the cyberware, I bought it. It sounded cool. I tried it out, and it was like basically a downgrade from what I already had. Kind of a bummer. If you aren't working on story missions or side jobs or gigs or whatever, the game has two types of open world encounters, which are labeled as crime and organized crime. The reported crime icons are very small little distractions that will basically take you to a group of 3 to 8 or so bad guys that are hanging out in like a parking lot. You'll shoot their faces off, pick up whatever the labeled objective is, and it's over. The organized crime missions are a slightly larger scale and oftentimes will be in like a medium-sized building or an area. And on rare occasion, they can be even larger scale than that. Both of these crime-type activities are a fun little distraction, and it's clear that they're placed in such a way to direct the player towards the places that are worth exploring. So that pretty much covers how you'll be spending your time throughout your playthrough, and I think it's time that we talk a bit about the game's biggest problems and where I think it could have used a little more time in the oven. For starters, and you've probably heard this, but the state that this game launched in is a complete mess. And on the base PS4 and Xbox One, it's even more of a mess than it is on PC, so much so that it's not even on the PlayStation Store for purchase anymore until further notice. You probably already know this, but if you have a PS4 or an Xbox One base console, don't buy this game on those systems until potentially February if those issues are fixed with their upcoming patches. Hold off at all costs. I personally played the game on PC, and while my PC is no pushover, the game is pretty poorly optimized for even slightly older CPUs. Currently, I'm running a i7 7700K, an RTX 3080, 32 gigs of RAM, and an NVMe M2 SSD, and the game will generally run close to or at 60 frames a second, but it does suffer from really not okay frame drops, especially in the most densely populated areas of the city. And this is most likely due to my CPU being a little bit older, but this is a PC that I can run Red Dead Redemption 2 on max settings, or even Assassin's Creed Valhalla at well over 60 FPS. All things considered, I think the game could have used a lot more optimizing on PC, and this is on a pretty high-end PC, so if you're considering playing with a lesser PC than that, you're going to have to make some sacrifices in terms of quality settings to achieve close to a sustainable frame rate. However, since I do have a relatively high-end computer and a relatively stable frame rate, the performance issues took a back seat compared to the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which are the bugs and the glitches. And I say this without hyperbole. This is the most buggy game I have ever played.
I don't know. Fuck's sake, leave me alone already.
And I'm sure that you can list a dozen of buggy games that you played at launch, and that's fine, but in my experience, nothing can hold a fucking candle to this game. As I played it, the bugs were literally almost a constant. It was rare that I went more than 5 minutes without seeing something. It might not have been major, but there was always something. And sometimes the glitches are funny, you know? Cars will spawn in the air, or they'll explode. People will spawn and get stuck inside of each other. People will be peeing nonstop for some reason. I don't know why. If you spin your camera around when you're looking at NPCs, they'll just change. They won't be the same. They're not constant. They're just changed. They just respawn every time you move. But the bugs can also be game breaking or immersion breaking. One bug I was constantly running into was my ankle would roll and I would die. Basically, if I jumped on something or slipped off a stair that was 2 feet off the ground, my character didn't know how to handle it and would just fucking roll over dead. I had issues where I would get stuck in the map screen and I couldn't interact with anything. So I had to quit and I would lose progress if I hadn't saved recently. Generally, it was only a few minutes, but that's a pain in the fucking ass. I also have a quest in the game that's straight up bugged for me, and getting 100% is not possible unless I replay it and hope that that quest is not bugged. And they just patched it, but the quest is still bugged for me. And there's also a real problem with these funny bugs breaking immersion. In the last cutscene of the game, my character's jacket started to flash and then disappeared off of his body. And then his clothes flew off and then they flew back. It's very funny, but in what's supposed to be like a, emotional moment, end of the game, my clothes flew off. Other times, NPCs will decide that they're scared of you while you're talking to them and start fucking running out the door. This is very funny, but also immersion breaking. I want to talk to you. Stop running away. And not to mention, there's a really big problem with texture pop-in, and it mainly happens as you're driving around. You'll just see buildings pop in, or while you're running, whatever. But, you can really see this in some places like the dump. As you approach the trash pile, it will be a barren mountain. And then the closer you get, big hunks of trash will pop in. The game is just really as janky as can be. And I really don't think the game should have launched in this state. I don't think anyone thinks the game should have launched in this state. And I really feel bad for the devs who crunched their asses off. They worked 12 or 16 hours a day. They poured their souls into this game, only to have management force them to fucking shove it out the door in the worst possible state. It's inexcusable on management's part. And really, the people of that team that worked so hard on it deserve a whole lot better than what they got. Bugs can be fixed and further optimizations can be done, and I only hope that the patches that are upcoming do address the bugs and address the performance issues, because, The Witcher 3 had a fairly rough launch, and it eventually made it to a place where most people, I would say, were pretty happy with it. They even reworked the movement system because people didn't like the momentum. But I can tell you that from my experience with this game at launch and The Witcher 3 at launch, both of them I took 4 days off to have a miniature LAN party with my wife. And this one is just a million times worse than The Witcher 3 ever was. And honestly, I think fixing the bugs and fixing the performance issues are the bare minimum of what I would expect to get fixed. But I don't think that its problems stop there. And I worry about holding on to any hope of the further issues getting addressed. But I still think that they're worth mentioning. so we should talk about it, but temper your expectations. For starters, and this is something that's been covered really widely, so I won't go too deep in it, but the AI of the NPCs, the crowds, the cars, it's pretty much the bare minimum requirement to be called AI or to have these sorts of things in the game. Crowds in the world will have a small handful of canned reactions to player actions. So if you fire a gun in the air, you'll often see a crowd full of people crouching down, and they'll stay in place indefinitely. And they'll only reset if you leave the area and respawn. You can stay there for 10 minutes, and they'll just sit there, just crouch down. It's bizarre. The NPCs that are walking around the city, they're on set paths. And sometimes you'll find the spot where the NPCs all turn around, and you'll see them all walk to the exact same spot on the sidewalk, pitch, and turn around. Police can't drive cars or pursue you, so instead when you commit a crime, they just spawn right next to you, or wherever you are. This includes being in the middle of fucking nowhere or on top of a building. It makes no sense. It's just like, the alpha state of this game made it to launch somehow. Like, they had the idea of AI, and this was their start, but they never went any further with it. And I gotta hope that they'll fix it. And the cars and driving AI in the game, if you can call it that, is even worse. They have no way to handle having their path interrupted. I first started noticing this when I would drive my car, stop in the middle of the street, and then run into a building for a quest. I would come out, and there would just be like a 20-car traffic jam, because no one knew how to drive around a car, even if it was just like an inch in the road. Just completely no driving AI. And your car is kind of like Roach, where you can hit a button and it will summon the car and drive to you, but it has the same problem. So if you try to summon your car where there's traffic, your car won't know what the fuck to do. It will just get stuck, or it will spawn under a car and the other car will explode, or whatever. Even worse, sometimes your car will just run you over, or it will just fucking run away from me and I can't catch it. It'll just keep driving. I don't know why. It just does. It just keeps going. Whatever. Earlier I mentioned the open world, sitting in a car, listening to the rain and drinking in the world, so to speak. Outside of those few moments where the stars really lined up and I felt the immersion of the world and I let my imagination do a lot of the work, the game really is lacking in any way to immerse yourself as part of the world. As you're doing story missions or as you're in motion for a quest or whatever, the city and its crowds and the noises and the cars are a backdrop to your actions and to your quests. And in that sense, it's pretty effective. But the moment you stop for a second and try to be a part of the city is where the facade shatters, and it's clear you're not meant to stop and smell the roses, and that the city is nowhere near as alive as it tries to appear. I think an important question to ask is, why would this be an expectation? And are players expecting too much from imagining themselves as a citizen of Night City and not just a visitor? And when it comes to the RPG elements or ways to immerse yourself in the game, I definitely think that the expectation and criticism is very valid. So in the early marketing of Cyberpunk 2077, it was described as a deep RPG. And CD Projekt Red made it clear that it was an RPG first and a shooter second. And I think somewhere along the line, deadlines crept up, or the game was very poorly managed and things started to change, because this game is not a deep RPG. And you might expect it to be. It's much more of a story-driven, open-world action game. And the Twitter bio was changed at some point to reflect that too. It is now called an open-world action-adventure story. There's no RPG in that bio. What's weird is the game features a lot of concepts that would be good for immersion, that are in the story or the lore of the game, but as the player, you don't get to freely take part in those or enjoy them. So for example, brain dances are something that multiple side missions or story missions will have you take part in, and basically it lets you play back someone's memory in the first person, but also lets you take a step out of their body, scan around the environment, and sort of do some detective work. In the E3 demo, V's apartment menu had a BD or brain dance section on it, and by the way, there is no apartment menu anymore. That's gone. Whatever. And in the game, you can even buy various brain dances, but you lack the compatible software to play them back. This might have been a cool collectible to find in the game, or it might have been a fun thing to unlock from vendors, and it would give you a non-V perspective on the world, or just little Easter eggs, man. But it's just not there. It's gone. It's just part of the story, despite, it being a core part of the lore. And there's kind of a staggering amount of these things in the story and side missions that would have added to the immersion of the game or given players something to do, but they're just not in anything besides those specific missions. At one point, you visit a dollhouse, which is exactly what it sounds like, but that's not in the game. But there are also just no leisure activities in the open world whatsoever. You know, many times in the game, you'll go to visit a bar with your friends, you'll sit in the stools, or you're sitting in the booth, and you'll have a drink with your friends, and you know, you'll throw the shot back in your mouth and you'll have a little chat, whatever. But in the open world, that's not there. You know, on the map, there are icons and it says this is a bar, and you come here and you kick back and you have a drink. But if you visit them, you can't sit at the bar. You walk up to a vendor, it has a menu. If you want to have a drink, you're not taking a shot off the bar, you're clicking it in your menu. That's it. And that stuff might seem minor, but these little things that you might expect to be in the game, they add up. And when you're missing so many of them, it really takes away from the experience. And on the other end, if they were there, it could add to the experience quite a bit. You know, there are no mini games. That means that there's no Cyber Gwent. There's a bunch of arcade machines, but you can't use any of them. There's a shooting range mission, but you can't just go to a shooting range. You know, there are hundreds of vendors around the city. You know, you walk through a market and there's like 20 food vendors or clothes vendors or whatever, newsstands, street vendors, porn shops, whatever, but you can't interact with any of them except for the few prescribed shops that are on the map. And it's like a couple dozen out of hundreds or more. And if you do try to go talk to one of these NPCs that's, you know, at a newsstand or at a food stand, he gives you the same stupid canned response as any other NPC in the world, like as if he wasn't, a food vendor or something. The game doesn't have public transportation or taxis. Like, you know, there are train stations in the game. In fact, some of the fast travel points are the doors to those train stations, but they're not in the game. In the pre-release stuff, it did show V on a train, but they said it was out. I don't know why. You have an apartment, but there's no real reason to ever visit it outside of, you know, dumping stuff in your stash. But you know, there's very little point to doing that either. You can't even go get a damn haircut. But to CD Projekt's credit, there are still some things you can interact with in the open world. There are data shards you pick up, which are basically notes. You know, they give you little tidbits of world building or little stories that happened. You can look in the mirrors that you find in bathrooms, although it's really awkward and very strange, and most of the time I did it, my character would be bald, even though he's not bald. And you can also use computers, and you can look at the weird websites that they've created. But all this stuff just feels like a missed opportunity, and it's exacerbated by the amount of things you'd want to be able to interact with not being interactable. And it feels like these things might have been on CD Projekt Red's list at some point of things to get done, but it just didn't quite make it in. You know, the arcades are all over, but you can't use them. You know, it's like all these things that are there, but they didn't quite make it all the way into the game. And that's really my other big complaint, is that so much of this game feels like the ideas were half-baked and never quite came together. So take, for example, the cyberware. Some of the more impactful cyberware in the game are the arm weapons. So one of these is the monowire. It's basically a light up whip, and you can use it in place of a weapon. It has some pretty cool animations, and it can slice dudes up. But unlike the other cyberware that you would get for your arms, it doesn't scale off any particular stat, so it's hard to sort of fit it into a build. And I think prior to release, this was a tool used to hack things at range. And I'm not entirely certain on this, but prior to release, you would also jack directly into people's heads to hack them. So I'm assuming that, like, instead of always remote hacking with a scanner like you do now, you would use the nano whip to remote hack people, and then otherwise you would be sneaking up behind people, jacking directly in and hacking them that way. So it would give it a place in the game, but the way it is now, it just has no place. There's no reason to use it. And then there's things like the gorilla arms. It says it does one thing and it just doesn't fucking do it. So the gorilla arms make you punch good, and that is that is a thing that it does, but it also says it will help you open doors that you couldn't otherwise open. So it doesn't. You would think that this means, you know, there are doors that require a certain amount of body attribute to open. So if you don't have 10 body, you can't open this. You would think that putting on those arms would give you an additional amount of body attribute to open those doors, but it doesn't. It just lets you open the same doors that you could open before. It's very, very strange, and it just is not there. It makes no sense. And then partway through the game, I got the mantis blades. I think they look dope, even though they're really glitchy. They chop fools the fuck up. They attack real fast. They felt really powerful. But then it wasn't too long before I got a new katana that was at my level. And then I realized, oh, the mantis blades just do straight up less damage than the katana. And then I found they had no purpose because they would just get completely outclassed by a very similar weapon. Even though these looked cooler, the katana just does more damage. And before release, these were used to hang on walls or even climb up walls, but that all got removed. So they removed the features, but didn't make up for the fact that these pieces don't have those features anymore. And now they're just like less effective alternatives to different weapons in the game. Very strange. The cyberware problems also continue, but the poorly thought out nature of these systems doesn't end there even by a long shot. If you're in need of a weapon, you might stop by a gun vendor and see what they have on offer. That sounds normal. And oftentimes they'll sell legendary weapons, which of course you would want to buy one of those. But then you look at the price of the guns and they cost more money than you've ever had in your entire playthrough. And then even if you could afford it, you'd buy it and then you level up a couple times and then the weapons you'd get just off random people would do more damage. So why the fuck would you waste your money on them? It makes no sense. You also have an equipment burden. So if you're carrying too many things, you want to break some stuff down or go sell it. Okay, that's fine. So you go to one of these devilry boxes where you can sell off your gear, but the box only has a $20,000 limit. So you can only sell so much to it. Okay, that makes sense. But then you rest for a few hours and then it will instantly refill the vendor's money. So if resting is instant, all it's doing is creating a step for me to go hit a button in my menu. Why does that exist? And even worse, I've had these fucking drinks in my inventory for the whole game, but anytime I try to go sell them, you have to click them and then you have to slide over the amount you want to sell and you have to click it again. And there's so fucking many of these that it's more of a hassle to sell them than just to keep them in my inventory. And so I'm forever burdened by vodka and Red Bull and I'm just going to deal with it. And the game doesn't seem to have any sense of balance when it comes to difficulty past level 20. I'm not sure if it's because I picked my perks wisely, but I was essentially an unkillable murder machine for the last 50 hours of the game. Everything would die in one hit, and I would fight these bosses, and I would stand still, fight them where they spawn. I wouldn't move even a fucking inch, and then they'd be dead, and I would turn around and find that there was a whole boss arena where I was supposed to be fighting this boss, but for some reason I was just invincible, and they died really quick anyway. And legitimately, the only times I ever did die is when I was standing next to one of the game's fucking million explosive barrels or whatever, and I would accidentally hit it with my sword, or the enemies in this game are fucking dead shots and shoot them the moment you stand next to them. You can even hit a toaster accidentally and you'll get one shot. It doesn't matter what level you are. Toasters, very deadly. When I first looked at the skill trees in the game, it gave me a sense that, building out your character in a specific way would be, interesting. And I would probably be excited to go play through the game as a hacker or a stealth guy later on. But the idea of builds in this game are totally pointless if there's no balance. And there isn't. And apartments are another thing. Aside from not having a reason to visit them, one time I had completed a side story and then I saw on the map that there was a second apartment icon and I was like, wait, do I have another apartment? That's what it says. So I went there and it's nothing. It's a mirror, but otherwise nothing significant. Why is this in the fucking game? And then there are other ones that the game even tells you hey, you got this apartment. It's yours. But there's no beds or anything that makes it why do I care? I don't want to go to this building. Why are they in the game? It's clearly an idea they had, but never finished. And when it comes to emergent events in the world, there's just one type, and it's dudes shooting each other. Gang members or cops fighting gangs or, gangs shooting people, whatever. And that's it. It's a few people shooting each other in an alley. And, in other games, take Red Dead Redemption 2, the world felt alive because as you explored it, random, cool, crazy shit would happen. And this game just doesn't. It has the idea of emergent events. It has one kind, but it doesn't have anything else. And the game constantly reminds you that it lacks follow through on little things. And I can't show you this because I'll spoil it, but I completed a character's side missions and they're a pretty major character. And then they said, hey, V, I'm going to leave town. I'm going to go to Oregon. I'm going to go visit my grandparents. I'll see you in another life. It's good to know you. Bye-bye. And so I went to their apartment because it said I had their apartment now and it was mine. And they were still there looking at me like I'm a fucking idiot. And I was like, what the fuck? So I talked to them and the conversation they had was hey man, how are you doing? I'm in Oregon having a good time all the way over in Oregon, but they were just standing in front of me. It made no fucking sense. There's no follow through. Another time I found dudes attacking a bartender. I saved his life, killed all the thugs that were in his bar. And he goes, dude, thank you so much for saving me. Any drink you want, it's on the house. And I go, yeah, man, I'll have a drink. So I opened his inventory menu and nothing was free. And I tried to buy something just to be sure, but no. It's no follow through at all. There's other half-baked shit too. The game has races. Each car has a gunner that's shooting at the other cars, but the gunners mean nothing. You can't die. You can't get shot and blow up. At least not as far as I fucking did. And none of the NPCs can die. Why does it exist? And even the race part of the races isn't real. If you crash your car and you stop completely, you look just a bit ahead, all of the other cars have stopped. They're waiting for you. They don't want to get too far ahead of you because they don't know what the fuck to do otherwise. And then on the flip side, if you're getting too far ahead, cars will just fucking spawn behind you. You can hear the noise that the enemies make when they're alerted to your presence because they're spawning and going, oh God, you're right in front of me. It's crazy. Other shit's in the game that is angering. Like at the first E3 demo, I took pages of notes, and one of the notes I said was destructible walls, question mark? Because in one of the early missions, there's a guy with a heavy machine gun. He's shooting a wall and the wall is crumbling, and I go, oh shit, that looks awesome. So I went to that mission, I got the gun after I killed him, and I shot the wall. And the wall fell apart, and I go, yes! The wall fell apart. And then I tried to shoot the other walls and they did not break. And then I started to realize that there are no other walls in the game that break. Sure, there are like things that fall over and things with the physics, but the destructible wall thing, complete fucking lie as far as I know. I did not find any other destructible walls. Why? Why does this wall exist? You are a wall of bullshit. I fucking hate you, wall. You stupid wall. Fuck you. And one of the biggest half-baked non-things in this game is the life path choice. For something that was like supposed to define your character and story, it's 20 minutes. Like I said before, like it's 20 minutes, you do the beginning, and then you're just on the same story as everyone else. I would expect that if I'm a corpo, that I'm fucking doing this quest from the perspective of a corpo. And I wonder if that's because the game changed so significantly when they got Keanu Reeves that they didn't have the ability to make the story any different. You had to do the same story. It's just shit, man. Like, yes, you have dialogue options, but they're meaningless. It's just like, yeah, I'm a nomad too. What do you think? And she goes, dude, you're a nomad? That's awesome. Let's move on with our lives. It's shit. And the game is full of this shit. Projects that were started and never finished, or never quite finished, or never even close to being finished. Even the attribute tree, it has 6 slots, but only 5 attributes. It shows you the 6th one, and it's all glitchy like it's supposed to be there, but it's not in the game. Why are you fucking showing me this? Why? There's also a ridiculous list of quality of life stuff, like the way you handle your inventory or navigating with your GPS is a fucking nightmare. But in the races, it shows you like an on-screen display of where you should drive and it's much more efficient. Why isn't that just in the game? I don't fucking know. God. And the last thing I want to talk about is the open world, and particularly exploration of the open world. I mentioned that the city is huge and detailed and beautiful, and I do believe that visually it is the best execution of a cyberpunk city that I could have hoped for. But this is not a game that I found to be rewarding or interesting to explore in any way. Partway through the game, I spent a really good amount of time, like 5-10 hours, just walking, trying to find shit. I would try to go into buildings, I would drive around the desert, I would climb on things to see if there was any secrets or anything fun worth finding. And a few times, my curiosity was rewarded, and I found things that I thought were a genuinely cool reward, a thing to find. One time, there was a cutscene in the game, and I randomly happened to stumble on the location of that cutscene. I found an item that was in that cutscene, and I went, oh, dude, this is a great reward. I explored the map, randomly stumbled upon this area, found this item, and now I have it. Only later did I get a mission that took me to the exact same spot. Even worse, every single thing I did find during my time exploring was later hand-fed to me by a mission or a side activity that would direct me right to it. So none of the stuff I found was actually, meant to be just found. It was meant to be handed to you in a mission later on. There was a few exceptions that were things that I found that weren't part of an icon on the map, and they were just small Easter eggs, whether it be like a little mini story of like a dead body and a shard, or like a movie Easter egg. And it's also a really big city. There's hundreds or thousands of buildings, and of course your initial desire is you want to explore those buildings. And unfortunately, the most common buildings that the missions will take you to are these 1 or maybe 2-story buildings. And when you do go to a skyscraper or one of those big city buildings during a mission, you don't see more than just the bottom floor and the floor you go up to in the mission. And even worse, like you don't go to any other rooms. Like if you go to a big apartment complex and you go up to the 15th floor, you're just going to go in the one room that the mission wants you to. You're not going to be able to explore the other fun ones. So at least from what I've found, you'll never find a building to explore that you aren't taken to in a mission or an activity. And even when you go in one of these places, like they limit the spaces you can actually enter. And I've seen some complaints that say all the doors in the game say locked when they actually mean inaccessible permanently. And I think that was something that was in The Witcher. And honestly, I don't think it's a reasonable expectation or even possible to have a game that has a city of this scale and have all the interiors explorable and modeled and whatnot. Maybe in the actual year 2077 that'll be a thing we can do, but right now it's not really possible. But that said, I do think there could have been more to explore and see in the city. Like it's pretty disheartening to walk like 2 or 3 blocks and just have solid walls of unenterable doors, And the other gripe I have with exploration is that for as much verticality as the city has, you're not really doing much in the upper tiers of the city. It goes without saying, there are no flying cars for the players to control, otherwise I would have said something about that because that sounds awesome. And outside of 2 to 3 story moments, you don't even get to get in one of those cars as a passenger. Thematically, it might make sense because V is a mercenary and a thug, and the upper class citizens are the ones that are going to be hanging out at the top of those buildings and the corporations, whatever. But I would have liked a way to experience the city from that perspective a lot more than we got a chance to. The further you explore the city, the more hollow it feels. Like you're clearly not meant to go off the beaten path. And in fact, in a lot of ways, the game might be better experienced by only doing the main story and the side jobs. The gigs and the other stuff do have miniature stories, but the rest of the content is just pretty superfluous. And maybe if I didn't take so much time looking at the world and exploring it so closely, I might still have that sense of wonder and curiosity that I did when I first saw it. Now, that is a whole lot of complaints about a whole lot of things, but make no mistake, I do think that the game is good. It's not great, but it's pretty good, and it does have a significant amount of content. 80 hours may not be hundreds of hours, but it's not a small amount. And despite it being completely imbalanced, I had a good amount of fun with the combat in this game. You know, if you gave me another 20 hours of content just to chop fools up, I would do it, and I would probably have a lot of fun. And they're probably going to do that with one of their DLCs in a couple years. And I did enjoy the story. I would have liked to have more agency over it, but I got to experience a story that was full of characters and depth, and let me do it in a setting that was pretty interesting. And it had Keanu Reeves. And I haven't really mentioned it, but the sound effects and the soundtrack in this game are fucking dope. All that said, the game is buggy as shit, and it runs really poorly for a lot of people. And beyond that, there are so many systems that feel half-baked or underdeveloped, and they could use a lot more time in the oven. And even worse, the world of Night City, the place you want to live in and be a part of, feels shallow and repels your desire to explore it. I don't think Cyberpunk 2077 is a bad game, but I'm pretty disappointed in what we ended up getting beyond the story. And it still kills me to feel this way. Honestly, after years of hype, it feels horrible. Overall, I would say that there is a good game in Cyberpunk 2077, but your best bet is to wait a while and see what fixes and content are added in down the line. Because as it stands, the game is not in its best state, and I think down the line it will become more complete, and you'll have a better overall experience with it, and the good parts of the game will be better. At the bare minimum, you'll have a better experience when they iron out some of the bugs and performance issues, and maybe even in a year or two, they'll address some of the game's deeper issues, add more content to it. I expect on some level that the bugs and the performance issues will be fixed. It seems inevitable, but who knows? But I'm also less optimistic about any other changes, about this other stuff I've talked about. What is a reasonable expectation for CD Projekt Red? What will they fix in this game? What can we expect of them? Is it crazy to ask or want them to expand RPG elements or expand the exploration and its rewards in the game? I don't know. I don't know at all. Anyways, that's Cyberpunk 2077. I don't know, man. I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for coming by. Bye.